The scorching sun blazed over the bustling streets of Lagos, Nigeria. The air was thick with the sound of honking cars, street vendors calling out their prices, and hurried footsteps of people trying to make a living. Among the crowd, a woman moved from car to car, balancing a tray of goods on her head. Her steps were slow but determined, her face wary yet strong. What caught the attention of passers-by, however, was not just her hustle, but the fact that she was heavily pregnant. At that moment, a sleek black SUV pulled up at a red light. Inside sat Big Shaq, the British rapper and comedian known for his viral hit, "Man's Not Hot." He was in Nigeria for an event, but today, something else was about to take his attention. As he glanced out the window, his eyes locked onto the pregnant woman struggling to sell her goods under the scorching heat. Sweat dripped from her forehead, but she pushed on, her voice barely above a whisper as she tried to attract buyers. Something about her struck him. Maybe it was the exhaustion in her eyes, the quiet resilience in her steps, or the thought of what it must take to survive in such conditions. For a moment, the noise of the city faded, and only one question filled his mind. Asterisk, how did she end up here? Asterisk. The traffic light turned green. Drivers honked impatiently, but Big Shaq didn't move. Instead, he watched, debating his next move. Should he step out? Should he help? He had no idea that this single moment was about to change everything for both of them. Big Shaq's driver glanced at him through the rearview mirror, waiting for instructions. The cars behind them grew impatient, honking loudly, but Shaq barely noticed. His focus was locked on the woman. The way she moved, slow and careful, one hand resting protectively over her belly, made something tighten in his chest. Finally, the car rolled forward, but Shaq found himself turning back, watching her grow smaller in the distance. He had been to many cities, seen struggle in different forms, but something about this moment stuck with him. Who was she? Why was she out here, in this condition, selling under the brutal heat? Did she have no one to help her? As they drove through the busy streets, the image of the woman stayed in his mind. He thought about the stories he had heard of Lagos, the endless hustle, the determination of its people, the sacrifices made every single day just to survive. But seeing it firsthand, so raw and unfiltered, was different. It was no longer just a story, it was real. Later that evening, as he sat in his hotel room, sipping a bottle of water, his mind drifted back again. He picked up his phone, scrolling through his contacts, wondering who he could call. He had connections, resources, maybe he could do something. But what if she didn't want help? What if she was used to this life, fighting her own battles? Something inside him wouldn't let it go. He had to find her. He had to know her story. But Lagos was a massive city, and she was just one face in the crowd. How would he even begin? The next morning, Big Shaq couldn't shake the image of the pregnant woman from his mind. He had seen struggle before, but something about her was different. It wasn't just the hardship, it was the way she carried herself, the quiet determination in her eyes. He had to find out more. After a quick breakfast, he called his local contact, Tund, a Lagos-based event organizer. "Bro, I need a favor," Shaq said, pacing the room. "Yesterday, I saw this woman on the street, pregnant, selling something under the sun. I need to find her." Tund chuckled. "Big man, you just described half of Lagos. People hustle here, pregnant or not. It's survival." Shaq sighed. He knew it wouldn't be easy. She was near that big junction around noon. Maybe someone knows her. Tund hesitated. "All right, I'll ask around. But don't get your hopes up. People like her, they disappear into the crowd." While waiting for Tund's update, Shaq scrolled through social media. He thought about posting something, maybe asking his fans in Lagos if they had seen her, but something held him back. What if she didn't want attention? What if exposing her story made things worse? Hours passed, no news. He grew restless. That evening, instead of waiting, he told his driver to take him back to the same spot. The streets were just as chaotic, vendors still weaving through cars, calling out prices, but she wasn't there. He asked a fruit seller nearby, describing the woman. The man scratched his head. Ah, pregnant woman. Yes, there are many. But one like that, I think I know who you mean. She comes here sometimes, but her life, it's complicated. Shaq's heart pounded. What do you mean? The man glanced around, as if checking for eavesdroppers. She doesn't just sell here. She's running from something. Shaq felt a chill. Running from what? And why did it feel like he was about to step into something much bigger than he expected? Shaq's breath caught for a moment. The noise of Legos faded into the background as the fruit seller's words echoed in his mind. Asterisk, she's running from something asterisk. He leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. What do you mean? What's she running from? The man hesitated, glancing around before speaking. Olga, it's not my story to tell, but I know people who know her. If you really want to help, you have to be careful. His voice was laced with something Shaq couldn't quite place. Concern, maybe even fear. Shaq reached into his pocket and handed the man a few bills. Just help me find her. The man took the money but shook his head. She doesn't come every day. Maybe tomorrow, maybe next week. But when she does, she stays near the corner by the old pharmacy. Shaq nodded, his mind racing. He had come to Lagos expecting a quick trip, events, media, a few meet and greets. But now he felt pulled into something deeper. That night, he barely slept. Who was this woman? What was she running from? And why did he feel like time was running out? The next day, he returned to the same spot, this time with Tund. They waited near the corner, watching the street vendors move in and out of traffic. Hours passed. Then, just when Shaq was about to lose hope, he saw her. She looked even more exhausted than before, her belly heavier, her movements slower. She stopped for a moment, pressing a hand to her back as if in pain. But before Shaq could approach, he noticed something else. Two men standing across the street, watching her closely. They weren't buying anything. They weren't moving. They were just watching. A chill ran down his spine. Was she in danger? Was this what she was running from? And then, just as Shaq made his move, the woman looked up, her eyes locking onto his for the first time. A flicker of recognition flashed across her face, but before he could say a word, she turned and bolted into the crowd. Shaq's heart pounded as he watched the woman disappear into the crowd. For a second, he stood frozen. Why had she run? Did she think he was a threat? Or was it the two men still standing across the street, their eyes darting in her direction? Tund grabbed Shaq's arm. Bro, she's gone. We can't just chase her through Lagos. But Shaq wasn't thinking. His feet moved on their own. He pushed through the crowd, weaving past street vendors and pedestrians, his eyes scanning every direction. The noise, the heat, the sheer movement of the city made it nearly impossible to focus, but he kept going. Then he saw her. She had slipped into a narrow alley, pressing herself against the wall, breathing hard. Her hand clutched her belly as if steadying herself. But before he could reach her, she turned again, ducking through a side street. Shaq rushed after her, but this time he wasn't the only one. The two men from across the street had also started moving. Their steps were fast, their faces unreadable. Something was wrong. Shaq wasn't sure what he had stepped into, but he knew one thing: this woman was scared. And whoever these men were, they weren't just curious bystanders. He pushed harder, finally breaking through the alley and spotting her just as she turned a corner. But as he followed, he suddenly felt a strong hand grab his shoulder. Stay out of this, a deep voice warned. Shaq spun around, locking eyes with one of the men. His expression was calm, but there was something cold behind it, something that sent a chill down Shaq's spine. This isn't your problem, the man continued, his grip tightening. Walk away. Shaq pulled back, his pulse racing. He had been in tough situations before, but this was different. The woman was still running, the other man trailing close behind her. And in that moment, Shaq realized something. This wasn't just about helping a struggling mother. This was something much bigger, something dangerous. But there was no way he was walking away now. Shaq yanked his arm free, his chest tightening with adrenaline. He had two choices: step back like the man had warned, or push forward into something he didn't fully understand. But the fear in that woman's eyes, the urgency in her steps, it told him all he needed to know. He had to keep going. He darted around the man, ignoring his shouts, and sprinted down the narrow alley. Up ahead, the woman stumbled, gripping her belly, gasping for breath. The second man was closing in on her. Shaq didn't think, he just acted. He lunged forward, cutting between them. "Back off," Shaq warned, squaring his shoulders. The man hesitated, eyes flicking toward his partner, who had just caught up. There was an unspoken exchange between them before they both slowly backed away. But their expressions said it all. This wasn't over. Without another word, they turned and disappeared into the crowd. Sharp turned to the woman. Up close, he could see the exhaustion on her face, the way she struggled to stay on her feet. "Are you okay?" he asked. Her eyes darted around, still filled with panic. But then, something unexpected. Tears welled up in them. She nodded weakly. "Come on, let's get you out of here," Shaq said gently. He signaled for Tund, who had just caught up, to bring the car around. They helped her in, and for the first time, she let out a shaky breath. As they drove away, the woman finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't think anyone would help me." Shaq frowned. "Who were those men? Why were they after you?" She hesitated, then finally met his gaze. "They work for my husband." A silence filled the car. Shaq hadn't expected that. He had thought she was just a struggling street vendor. But now it was clear, she wasn't just running from poverty. She was running from someone powerful, someone who didn't want her to be free. And now Shaq was caught right in the middle of it. Shaq sat in silence, letting her words sink in. She was running from her own husband. That explained the fear in her eyes, the way she had disappeared into the crowd the moment she saw him. Whoever this man was, he had power, and she knew he wouldn't stop looking for her. She stared out the window, her hands resting protectively over her belly. "I had no choice," she said softly. "If I stayed, I don't know what would have happened to me, or my baby." Shaq exhaled, glancing at Tund, who looked just as tense. This wasn't just about helping a stranger anymore. It was about making sure she was safe. He had resources, connections. He could do something. "We'll figure this out," he said firmly. "You don't have to go through this alone." She looked at him then, really looked at him, as if trying to decide whether she could trust him. And slowly she nodded. They drove in silence for a while before Tund spoke up. "I know a place she can stay for now. Somewhere safe." Shaq nodded. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was a start. She needed time, space to breathe, a chance to figure out her next move without fear lurking around every corner. As they pulled up to a quiet guest house, she turned to Shaq one last time. "Thank you," she whispered. "You didn't have to stop that day, but you did." Shaq managed a small smile. Sometimes, stopping changes everything. As she stepped out and disappeared inside, Shaq sat back, staring out into the Lagos night. He hadn't expected this journey, but somehow he knew he was exactly where he was meant to be.